Good morning to you all, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this important event that we are hosting this morning at the African Union mission to the United States and in Washington. I would like to first start by acknowledging the presence of their Excellencies, and I see on the stage Dr. Mohamed Mayet, the Minister of Finance of Egypt. Allow me also to recognize the presence of Mr. Sid Ahmed Bouli, who is the Economic Advisor of the President of the Republic of Mauritania. And as you are well aware, Mauritania is the country that is leading the African Union this year as chairperson of the Union. Allow me also to recognize on the stage the presence of my dear sister Anna Morsi. She is the Deputy Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and more importantly to recognize our co-host today, Anna Reeder, which is the CEO of Development Reimagined, an organization with which the African Union Commission is partnering for this event. It is truly a pleasure for me to stand before you this morning as we speak to a very important topic, which is linked to the economic situation of our countries. And as you are all aware, our countries are facing a turbulent environment with issues relating to debt. Our discussion this morning will therefore aim to look at the solutions that we can frame to make sure that we are able to equip our countries with the necessary capacities and possibilities to navigate the difficult environment in which we are today. On an historical perspective, you can see that in the 1970s already, we had the same issue, with our countries facing difficult debt crisis. And we also saw the same problem in the 1980s. And now we are in the 20s, and we still see our countries facing the same challenges. So the discussion this morning, which will be an open discussion, will allow us to better understand how we can support our countries going forward. And I would like to thank all the ministers that are present this morning and recognize their presence. That is extremely important as we move forward in this process of crafting African solutions to African problems. With no other further development, allow me to first give the floor to His Excellency Mohamed Mayet. This morning, Your Excellency, we had an interesting discussion, and you highlighted, exceptional points with regards to the debt situation of our countries. Can you share with the audience, your perspective on what we are faced with today and what can be the possible solutions? Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation and to share our thoughts with regard to the global debt relief system for African interests. Let me say that the current global financial system often fails to address the debt challenges for African economies. To develop a comprehensive approach that addresses the unique challenges faced by African countries while promoting sustainable development and economic growth. There is a need first to understand the root causes of debt in Africa. African debt often stems from a complex mix of factors, including historical imbalances in lending practice, volatile commodity prices, and external economic shocks. There is a need to differentiate between these sources the current relief programs can come with stringent conditions that hinder growth, like cuts to essential social services. Africa needs debt relief that prioritize investment in critical areas like education and healthcare. Furthermore, debt negotiations often lack transparency, leaving African nations vulnerable to unfair terms. Therefore, any debt relief system for Africa should prioritize clear communications and accountability from all parties involved. Such a system should cover the following aspects. Number one, tailored debt restructuring. Instead of one-size-fits-all approach, debt restructuring should be tailored to the specific circumstances of each African country. This could involve negotiating interest rates, extending repayment periods, or even partial debt forgiveness based on countries' ability to implement structural reform and promote sustainable development. Number two, debt for development swaps. Encourage creditors or creditor nations and international financial institutions to offer debt for development swaps. In these arrangements, a portion of a country's debt to be forgiven in exchange for investment in key sectors such as infrastructure, healthcare, education, and renewable energy and climate change. This not only reduces debt burdens, but also promote long-term economic growth and poverty reduction. Number three, enhanced debt transparency. Improve transparency in debt contracts and lending practices to prevent unsustainable borrowing and ensure that loans are effectively utilized. This could involve requiring lenders to disclose the terms and conditions of loans, as well as providing support for African countries to build the capacity for debt management and negotiation. 4. Promote domestic resources mobilization. Encourage African countries to prioritize domestic resources mobilization through measures such as strengthening tax system, combating illicit financial flows, and promoting good governance. By reducing dependence on external borrowing, countries can build economies that are more resilient and reduce vulnerability to debt crisis. Number 5, debt relief conditional on good governance and accountability. This debt relief and restructuring initiatives to commitment from African governments to improve governance, combat corruption, and enhance accountability. This ensures that debt relief translates into tangible benefits for the people of Africa and promote sustainable development outcomes. Number 6, innovative financing mechanism. Explore innovative financing mechanisms such as diaspora bonds, green bonds, and social impact bonds to diversify sources of funding for African countries and reduce reliance on traditional debt financing. These mechanisms can attract investment for development projects while offering attractive returns to investors. Number 7, debt relief coordination and collaboration. Strengthen coordination and collaboration among creditor nations, international financial institutions, and African governments to ensure coherence and effectiveness in debt relief efforts. This could involve establishing a dedicated platform or mechanism for dialogue and coordination on debt relief initiatives. 8. Addressing systemic issues. Address systemic issues in international financial system that contribute to debt vulnerabilities in African countries, such as volatile commodity prices, currency fluctuations, and restrictive trade practices. This may require reforms at the global level to promote a more equitable and sustainable financial architecture. Number 9, promote inclusive growth. Ensure that debt relief and restructuring efforts align to promote inclusive growth and poverty reduction in Africa. This includes prioritizing investment in social sectors, supporting small and medium-sized enterprises, and creating opportunities for youth employment and entrepreneurship. Number 10, empower and ownership. Empower African countries to take ownership of their development agendas and actively participate in decision-making process related to debt relief and restructuring. This includes building capacity for effective debt management and negotiation, as well as fostering partnerships based on mutual respect and cooperation. The current global financial architecture is not supportive developing countries, in addition, more specifically African countries. The current economic challenges call for action to address two of the main challenges grappling the African economies, which are the high debt levels and climate change. In this regard, Egypt Ministry of Finance, in cooperation with the Economic Commission for Africa, announced a Sustainable Debt Coalition initiative during Financing Day on the margin of COP27 held in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt in 2022. The coalition aims to create the needed physical space for developing countries to pursue their development and climate ambitions. It is worth mentioning that the resolution adopted last year during COM 2023 and ministerial statement of COM 2024 were supporting the advancement of the goals of the Sustainable Debt Coalition. In this regard, I would like to reiterate our invitation to African member states to join this coalition and express our readiness to cooperate with African Union in order to speak with one voice. This should help us to ensure no one left behind while we attempt to address two important challenges facing all African economies: elevated debt and debt services, as well as climate change challenge. Thank you very much for kind attention.
Your Excellency, your words of wisdom when you outlined the 10 priorities that we should focus on really enriched the debate and opened, our perspective in terms of what needs to be done. We thank you sincerely for that, and I would like now to turn to our next speaker. Just for few remarks, I would like to call upon our chair of the union just to say a few words with regards to what has just been said. So, Mr. Sid Ahmed. Thank you very much. So, Your Excellency, I want to outline the fact that His Excellency Minister Mayet has another critical appointment and he's leaving us in a few minutes. So if you see him leaving, it is not that he has, decided to leave us alone, but it is because he has another pressing, engagement. So, Your Excellency, we thank you sincerely for your kind presence and words, and we wish you a very fruitful day and fruitful, spring meetings. Minister.
Thank you so much. I beg your pardon. I will speak in Arabic.
Yes, we have.
Okay. Exactly.
Only French.
شكرا جزيلا معالي الوزير محمد. French and English. I will speak in French. Okay.
Thank you.
No problem. Très bien. Merci beaucoup, Excellence. Excellence, Monsieur le ministre des Finances de l'Égypte, pour la brillante prestation que vous venez de faire sur cette problématique de la dette en Afrique. Comment nos pays se sont retrouvés face à un endettement, une crise d'endettement abyssale et en même temps incapables d'apporter les réponses appropriées en termes d'initiatives pour le développement de nos pays. Très rapidement, j'ai schématisé les sources principales ou comment a-t-on arrivé à cette situation. Le lendemain de l'indépendance de la plupart de nos pays, la crise de la dette a commencé à créer son effet très négatif sur je disais que depuis pratiquement l'accession à l'indépendance de la plupart de nos pays, la crise de la dette commence à poser problème. Et c'est comme ça que cette crise a été, ses effets ont été multipliés par la faiblesse de la base productive dans la plupart de nos économies, qui étaient essentiellement des économies orientées vers les matières premières, peu de production et de création de valeur ajoutée locale. Donc, ceci étant dit, les défis qui se posent aujourd'hui à nos pays sont des défis multiples et variés. Le premier entre eux, c'est d'abord l'élaboration d'une approche cohérente et efficace pour gérer la dette dans notre région, en Afrique. La deuxième, à mon avis, c'est garantir l'accès à des financements concessionnels et des financements soutenables, des financements durables qui n'hypothèquent pas l'avenir de notre continent et qui assurent des ressources nécessaires pour le développement et pour amorcer les différentes initiatives d'industrialisation dans notre continent. La troisième, à mon avis, c'est appuyer les bases productives qui sont indispensables pour que l'Afrique puisse s'insérer dans les rouages du commerce international tout en créant suffisamment d'emplois et en tirant profit de son dividende démographique. Quatrième point, c'est la mobilisation des financements qui aident l'Afrique à composer avec les effets négatifs des changements climatiques. Comme vous savez très bien, les sécheresses frappent partout dans nos pays, les déficits pluviométriques, les inondations, les problèmes que rencontrent nos agriculteurs partout dans les 4 coins de l'Afrique. Et ça pose un problème sérieux et un besoin réel de financement pour l'atténuation de ces effets négatifs des changements climatiques. Les promesses qui ont été souvent annoncées n'ont jamais été suivies par une réalisation effective. Et donc, du coup, de grande messe à une grande messe, de réunion à réunion, on sort avec des promesses, mais le lendemain, on ne voit pas une grande concrétisation. Cinquième point, c'est les conditions nécessaires pour une transition énergétique juste pour nos pays. On ne contribue pas assez dans l'émission de gaz à effet de serre et donc on nous demande en même temps de contribuer efficacement dans... je pense que cette thématique doit être abordée avec beaucoup de prudence et d'intelligence. L'Afrique a besoin de passer des fossiles vers les énergies propres, mais cela doit être pensé dans le cadre d'un modèle qui prenne en considération d'abord les responsabilités de l'Afrique dans ce qui s'est passé au niveau de notre planète, ensuite les besoins de l'Afrique aussi pour assurer l'accès à l'électricité, l'accès à des sources pérennes et la continuité d'assurer l'électricité pour notre industrie. Tout ceci m'amène à dire ou arriver à la conclusion qu'il faut impérativement accélérer les réformes et les initiatives en cours pour la réforme de la gouvernance des institutions financières mondiales, parce que c'est un point inévitablement lié avec les efforts de la nouvelle approche pour la gestion de la dette. Donc, tant qu'on n'est pas sorti d'un système de gouvernance qui n'apporte pas une réponse appropriée, donc on va continuer à avoir un problème. La Mauritanie souhaite bien sûr tous les succès pour l'initiative et la coalition que M. le ministre vient de mentionner tout à l'heure dans son discours sur la dette. Je pense que nos pays sont appelés plus que jamais à conjuguer leurs efforts pour que cette initiative fasse son chemin et que nos pays puissent faire entendre leur voix à l'échelle mondiale et à l'échelle régionale. Et donc c'est ce que mon pays compte de faire au cours de son mandat de président de l'Union africaine, sur tous les niveaux, au niveau de sommet des chefs d'État, au niveau des réunions techniques des ministres de l'économie et des finances et au niveau des experts. Je vous remercie, M. le ministre.
Merci beaucoup, and thank you very much. I think, Your Excellency, thank you once again, and wishing you a blessed day. See you later during the day. Thank you. Just a little clarification. I like unconventional, organization of things, because we have completely changed, the way the agenda was outlined to make sure that we have an extremely interactive session. And you can see that we were able already, to tease out the key messages that needs to be conveyed to our member states and also to the international community with regards to the issue of debt management. Let me now come back to what we had on the program and invite my dear sister Anna to, make her presentation for us to understand the dynamics of the process in which we are today, which is a data-driven approach and a data-driven, analysis, which we will present, and then we will head back, to the rest of the meeting with the question and answers, but also the participation of our financial institutions that are in the room that will be presenting in a short moment. So thank you very much, Anna. The floor is yours for your presentation. Can we have the presentation on the screen? Thank you.
Good morning, honourable ministers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, in the room and online. Habari za asubuhi, all protocol observed. I'm Hannah Wanjiya-Ryder, the CEO of Development Reimagined. We are an African-led, African-owned independent international development consultancy. We have our offices in Nairobi, Beijing and London, and it is an extreme pleasure to be co-hosting this event with the African Union here in Washington, D.C., and in the presence of you all online and here in this room. Today I'd like to discuss, as briefly as I can, some ideas for reimagining the global debt relief system, which are in African interest. We've already heard the ministers share ideas. My ambition with this presentation is to open up the discussion. Patrick mentioned, he mentioned a data-driven approach. Most certainly, that's one of the approaches we are known for, but also to make this a frank and realistic discussion about our needs that stems from African interest point of view. When we're looking at economic and foreign policy, many of the world's most successful countries have started with their interests first. What do they think is a system that would work for them? And then they decide how they want the institutions to fit. This is exactly the same process that we should take in this. And so for my presentation, I hope you will take 3 key messages. Number one, that it is clear that the current system does not work in African interests. Number 2, that African interests require simpler and faster forms of debt relief, and I think we've had, again, both of the ministers emphasize that. And third, that there is a broad spectrum of concrete ideas for a new debt relief system. But some will be harder work, but those harder work options may well be more rewarding than the temporary fixes. Learning from history. And again, Patrick was encouraging us to learn from history. So let's start with a bit of data. Where are we when it comes to debt on the continent? I know a lot of people often use the debt distress figures. For various reasons, at Development Reimagined, we do not use those debt distress figures. We believe that there is a bias behind them. But what we can see is that there's an aggregate debt to GDP terms. We are at around 1984 levels of debt to GDP ratios. And that is significantly lower than the worst seen in the late 1990s. But this does not mean that our debt servicing is not extremely difficult. Again, we've heard numerous times ministers speak My apologies. Yes. Oh, thank you very much. Understood. I hope that helps for the viewing. Thank you for that. African governments are collectively paying around $130 billion a year in debt servicing costs. These are record levels in absolute terms, and approximately 60% of this is just interest. Some African countries are most certainly facing a debt liquidity crisis. A few others are facing a debt solvency crisis. But most importantly, we must remember that all are facing a long-term crisis of insufficient and expensive debt for development. This is our starting point. Next slide. At the same time, we have to remember that African debt as a whole is a tiny fraction of global debt. Even just as a proportion of low and middle-income country debt, Development Reimagined analysis found that Africa accounts for 11%. So if there is a crisis, it is one that the world has the resources to manage and cope with without significant impact on well-being in non-African countries. Next slide. Although it is said that we have a more complex mix of creditors today, we also need to remember that in reality, different types and costs of debt have been taken by African governments for multiple purposes by a wide range of creditors for a long time. Countries like China, UAE, Saudi Arabia, India have emerged and been able to provide more lending in recent years, but other non-bilateral loans remain and have been a crucial part of the picture. This was also the case in the 1970s, by the way. Next slide, please. Last but not least, with just 6 years to reach the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and as Development Reimagined forecasting shows, illustrated here for one of the G20 common framework countries, Ethiopia, there are still huge financing gaps across the African continent that need significant new, highly concessional debt, much larger than the existing debt ceilings and IMF quotas would enable. In addition, the trade shocks, the economic shocks, COVID-19 pandemic, Russia-Ukraine war, these have all impacted Africa's ability to fund our long-term development. And many of these challenges, these external challenges, will require African governments to raise more, not less, external debt. However, our previous and most recent experiences with debt relief have been less than helpful. So let's go back to the 1980s first. In 1984, 1985, and 1987, let's go to the next slide, please. There were African coordination conferences convened by the then OAU and UNECA. And at that point, African governments were very clear on many of the issues that we talk about today. And they made some very practical, coordinated suggestions for how to tackle them. They were talking about the same things that we do today, how much IDA should be, how much the interest rates and maturity should be on IDA and so on, the thresholds. They also called for an international conference on Africa's external indebtedness, which would be held in 1988 and to which international creditors and multilateral organizations would be invited. Furthermore, in a speech entitled A United Front Against Debt, we know made at the 1987 OAU conference, the then president of Burkina Faso, Mr. Thomas Sankara, stressed that other countries have clubs or groups in which discussions of African debt are held, and said that Africa has the duty to create the united front of Addis Ababa against the debt through its own dialogues and groups. However, neither the International Conference nor the Addis Club were ever convened. Instead, over time, what we did see was the emergence of a major debt crisis. Internationally, few had listened to African governments. Creditors stuck to a narrative implying that the debt taken was bad, that African governments had borrowed irresponsibly, and little distinction was made between spending that had generated growth, capital investments, and other spending. The narrative was bolstered by a handful of African countries, like today, that defaulted on debt payments, raising concerns across the international community about whether other countries might do the same. The overall result was that the status quo remained. Meanwhile, African countries were forced to take major steps in the 1990s and 2000s to renegotiate debt one by one and try to revive economic growth. A good example is Somalia, as we see here on this slide, who was initially expected to be part of the highly indebted poor country initiative announced first in 1996, and it took until this year, after Somalia formally engaged, coming out of civil war, formally engaged in the HIPC process from 2012 onwards, but it took until 12 years later, after 4 rounds of policy reforms, to get relief worth $4.5 billion US dollars in the end. Now Somalia is able to to access more financing. Next slide, please. Another recent experience with debt relief has been the debt service suspension initiative due to COVID-19. We must remember that only 20 African countries joined this initiative in the end, even though 38 were eligible. And it was only applied to bilateral debt. So if you recall a previous slide that I showed with the amounts of multilateral and private sector debt, that wasn't covered, so that servicing had to continue. And there were also a number of countries that decided not to suspend their servicing, even though they could, because they were concerned that they may be penalized in terms of future interest rates payments. And there are significant challenges with regards to future debt servicing implied by these sorts of proposals, even though at the time it was very important to utilize and was very helpful for many countries. Last but not least, in terms of recent experience, we have the case of Zambia. Next slide, please. In May 2020, the Zambian government, I know you're here, you appointed financial advisor Lazare to help restructure its then $11 billion US worth of external debt. A few months later, in November 2020, Zambia defaulted on a bond payment and became the third country to apply for relief under the G20 Common Framework. After multiple rounds of discussions, including commitments to cut some future spending on infrastructure projects, there was still very little movement because creditors were wrangling between themselves over issues such as the concept of comparability of treatment. In March 2023, Zambian Treasury and Central Bank representatives took the initiative to visit one key creditor, China, work out a plan for restructuring, with the banks having successfully negotiated over $200 million US of relief with China in the past, without the help of other creditors. Zambia then presented these results to the Paris Club, who agreed to similar terms in October 2023. The agreement included a 3-year grace period and an extension in maturities to over 20 years. However, there was a further setback a month later when the restructuring with Eurobond creditors could not be implemented, again due to issues with comparability. And at the same time, this issue was just recently resolved after the President spoke about the experience of the Common Framework having been an indictment on a process that Zambia had joined in good faith. So although Zambia has managed to come to a much better situation, and I think that is definitely agreed, it has been extremely painful. And these challenges, and let's go to the next slide, these challenges, even if they do get to a good outcome in the end, and this is not to say that the processes like HIPEC, MDRI, like DSSI, like the Common Framework, have not been good in the end. They have still been significantly problematic for our countries for 5 different reasons. The key challenge with most of these initiatives has been that they have been using creditor coordination as their main modality. Even though the fact is that creditors have different backgrounds, have different abilities to take risk, have charged different interest rates. Borrowers have been treated separately on a case-by-case basis, even if they face similar challenges and similar external events, such as COVID-19. Borrowers have been assumed to spend badly. Creditors have been unwilling to take risk, using the argument of moral hazard to deter defaults. And overall, it is a system which has been very difficult for borrowers. And in fact, it's not really a system that has ever worked in history. Next slide, please. If we take a broader view of history, the views on debt relief are along a spectrum and are quite often depending on how you see borrowers and creditors. On one end, you see a system which enables total amnesty, total relief, and on the other end, you see systems that end in pain, in imprisonment, if it was individuals. But as sovereign lenders, it becomes higher interest rates and higher premiums. And on this end, if you see borrowers as corrupt and poorly educated, spending badly, then of course they need management to avoid moral hazard. And if you see creditors as charitable and somehow cash-strapped themselves, again, you will not be willing to provide too much relief because the creditors need to also be looked after. On the other hand, and again, we have to look to history for these different examples, if you see creditors as unscrupulous and or fairly rich compared to the borrowers, then amnesties are more justifiable. Amnesties have been done by kings and, in very unequal societies. But if you also see borrowers as entrepreneurial, constrained by capital or collateral, then again, amenities, things like amnesties will also be, relief and jubilees will also be more justifiable. And these are choices. Our system is a choice. You design a system depending on what you think, whether creditors are rich, are charitable, or whether you think borrowers are constrained or corrupt. European bankruptcy laws, for example, from the 1500s onwards, were designed based on the view of corrupt and poorly educated borrowers. So that's why they had debtors' prisons. But gradually another view emerged based on US laws from the 1900s onwards, where borrowers were seen as the ones who were really trying to take risks. And so they needed fresh starts, they needed clean slates, and that's what amnesties are often about. And I would say that right now, our system, the global international financial system for debt, from in particular the Common Framework, is designed in such a way that borrowers are cast in the light of being poorly educated and creditors charitable. And that's why debt relief has been so painful. So what could the alternatives be? And we are in this room in order to talk about alternatives. And we have seen some excellent new initiatives being proposed from all sides of the world, including the African continent, on what could come next. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. We can identify, that's too far. Let's go just one before, thank you. We can identify 8 distinct concrete ideas Now, although others are out there, and I have not mentioned all of these necessarily in specific names, but I will do hopefully as I quickly describe these, but many are variations of these themes. And as we move from 1 to 8, many require, the ones towards 8 require more shifts to the international systems, even new institutions to be set up. On the first start, we have the idea of expanding the status quo, so expanding the G20 common framework to cover middle-income countries or to cover certain types of debt that wasn't included before, kind of like what the HIPC and then MDRI did, for example, MDRI expanded HIPC to multilateral finance. Another set of ideas is to improve the common framework, for example, by having stronger definitions around and deadlines around the outcomes for each country. So if we're talking Zambia, we would say it wouldn't have been a 3 or 4 year process. If the idea would be to impose a deadline of 6 months or 1 year for all of that discussion. There are other ideas which are around extending the debt service suspension initiative or issuing new Brady bonds. The reason I put those into the same category is because they really, in particular, the extensions of service really apply in particular to private sector, concerns around private sector financing. So a lot of the proposals, there's a proposal called the Bridge Proposal, for example, which really tries to focus on private sector debt. And as we know, there was an initiative called the Brady Bonds Initiative in the late 1980s, which also aimed to bring down the cost of private sector debt. And there are other proposals around for that at the moment. There's also, number 4, there are also ideas, and we also had the minister mention one of these, the minister from Egypt mentioned this, the debt swaps, debt for climate swap, debt for nature swaps. Those are also in one of the new proposals for dealing with debt. Again, those are done on a one-to-one basis for countries and can involve several creditors, but at the moment there's no suggestion that they would involve several borrowers together. There's also ideas, and there's many organizations that do feel it's time to launch a new HIPC or MDRI process. There are also new organizations that are being created, have been created to enable collective debt relief, not coordination, but also debt relief negotiation. And I would say the Sustainable Debt Coalition, in terms of thinking about the parameters for debt relief, is one of those, and that was, as Minister Mait was talking about, was announced at the COP. And then there are also, and 7th, we have proposals out there which are not in a great deal of discussion, but are out there about using the IMF or the UN, UNCTAD in particular, as a debt arbiter. And then last but not least, ideas around having a totally independent sovereign bankruptcy court, which would not have a lender itself, such as the IMF or grantee or UN, being involved, because that would involve some degree of my words have just left me, but it's a conflict of interest. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you. But that would a completely independent sovereign bankruptcy court for fresh starts. So what are the pros and cons, and do they solve this? Effectively, the idea of creating some sort of middle ground for managing borrower behavior as well as creditor behavior, if that's the kind of idea that we might want to end at. We can look at various issues from a borrower and creditor perspective. I will not go through, let's go through the next slide. I will not go through these in significant detail, but this presentation will be circulated, so you will be able to look at this slide in more detail, the different pros of the reform proposals out there. You can see a lot of the pros are in this space of being able to manage creditor and borrower behavior. A lot of the initial proposals that I mentioned at the beginning really manage creditor behavior very little, and achieving a fair burden share effectively between borrowers and creditors for collective debt relief. Many of these proposals do aim to minimize conditionality. Again, we heard from ministers that that's very important. They can apply at scale and can also apply to a wider range of creditors than the common framework and also the Brady-Bronze. They could give more flexibility. Let's go to the cons, the next slide. Again, the cons there are multiple cons with all of these different initiatives. Some of them preserve the bias towards favoring creditors. There are others, we mentioned the phrase creating a conflict of interest, and also quite uncertain. There are some which are too small to make a significant dent on some of the debt issues that we're talking about. But at the same time, some, like a new bankruptcy court, could perhaps be too major and perhaps unrealistic. So, with that, let me end by reminding you of just the three key messages I hope to drive home today, and also to leave you with a few questions for reflection. The current system is not a system that works in African interest because we are at this point majority borrowers, although in future I'm sure we plan to be majority creditors. African interests require simpler and faster forms of debt relief. There is a broad spectrum of concrete ideas, and some will be harder work. There's pros and cons to all of them, but we should assess all of them with an African interest perspective in mind. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and let me turn to the discussion now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was brilliant, and I would like to, beg for a second round of applause for excellent. So, Excellencies, distinguished participants, you have just, listened to Hannah, and you've seen, the issues that she was able to table. What I would like to first emphasize is that the approach that we're having today to democratize the discussion on these issues is about to widen the scope of our understanding of how we can better find solutions to what we are facing. So allow me now to open the discussion, and starting with one of the prominent voice in this space, because the person I'm referring to has been extremely vocal, as she is part of the high-level working group on the reform of the global financial architecture. I'm not sure she needs to be presented because she is sitting just in front of you, and I would like to recognize her and let her, identify herself and tell us what are the key takeaways that she got from this presentation, and what are the key asks with regards to debt issues that we can put forward as we are trying to find optimal solutions to the problem that we're facing. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm Hanan Morsi. I'm the Deputy Executive Secretary and Chief Economist for United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. And we've been working very closely with the African Union Commission on a variety of issues, including debt issues. I think really our speakers today did a great job in putting together from a different perspective the issues. All African countries have huge development financing need. Also needs to deal with climate action, and needs also to deal with efforts to recover from frequent and recurrent global shocks. The having debt or financing in itself, there is no stigma about it. But what it boils to is the following. One is, what is that debt used to create actually the high returns and the capacity for that debt to be repaid. And that is, the ownership of the African countries on how they put the debt to good use. Second is the issue of cost of debt, because you can be using the debt for good use, but if it's too expensive to actually service it, to maintain it, it's not going to do you any good, because if you cannot generate the higher than that cost of debt in terms of returns, you're not going anywhere. So on that cost of debt is, I think, part of the issue that we have to focus on getting resolved, so that we don't end up in this vicious circle of just trying to fix the problem. If you don't structurally fix it to actually have affordable long-term financing, we will be going back in this after, if we solve this now, we will be again in few years talking about it again. So let's try to deal with the major issues rather than with the symptoms. And that's why we've been talking before about the need to ensure long-term affordable access for finance for African countries. The situation we're in now, we have a staggering debt level, in the continent. Actually, on average, weighted average is reaching 66% of GDP. Even more, we have a liquidity squeeze, because we have a looming wall of debt service the continent is facing of $89 billion for this year, just for this year. That's in interest payments and principal repayment. At the same time, we are faced with a global situation where we see the official development assistance declining. If we combine that with the fact that we are in a world where geopolitical tensions are rising, and basically many donor countries are diverting resources from development assistance to security, I think that gives you, kind of the picture of what we have to deal with. So, what does it mean? How do we take that into action? I think part of that action will have to be ensuring that concessional financing windows are sustained, like including whether it's from the IMF, World Bank, African Development Bank, all the windows that African countries have access to are utilizing, that this is sufficiently funded, and that, like for all our member states, means that you need to make the case, including showcasing, and I'm looking at the Honorable Minister of Finance for Rwanda. Rwanda have done very well, for example, in using some of these resources for PRGT, for resilience and sustainability, to showcase in country cases. Mauritania did also benefit from PRGT, how this made a difference for the country. You need to translate that into, like, a way to we're not talking about numbers, we're talking about how this has been transformative, how it made a difference for the country to, move, to do reforms, to improve the lives of their citizens. That's one. Two, I think, maybe I'm an economist, but in general, in these discussions, we tend to focus more on the numbers and lose sight of the human perspective. And I think we are at a stage where this has to be the focus. So when we're talking about this, we're not talking about, how much we are asking in debt relief, or how much we're asking that, to give support or finance. We need to translate that into what is the cost of just maintaining the status quo. What does it mean? How did this delay, say, in actually reaching restructuring meant for, citizens in Zambia, okay, or in other countries where it means basically, you don't have FX to get urgent medical supplies, or to, get basic, human needs that actually affects the well-being, the medicines that your citizens need. I think we really need to shift that conversation because we are kind of like taking it into figures, numbers, and at the end, that's not what matters. What it matters is how it translates to our citizens. So I think we need to bring more of that into the discussion, and we need to be firm about how, especially for the good cases that have benefited from that debt, how that debt has been used, and for the ones that are in, debt distress not because of the level of debt, but because of the cost of debt. I think also we need to build the capacity to come back to the table with our own debt sustainability analysis scenarios. Okay, if it's the cost, then we do scenarios where we show that this debt can be sustainable at what cost of interest. It's not a one-way conversation. It's actually, we need to do from our side the homework to show that. No one is going to do it for us, because I think I heard the word earlier, conflict of interest. You cannot expect the one that are on the other side, charging you the interest, to be the one that is doing that for you. It has to be owned by you to actually show when you're negotiating how this would make a difference if it was instead. There are some countries, I'm not going to name countries, that had to pay 10% interest rate or above. It's just, how could that be? No matter how good you do, there is a certain level of interest payment that would be just too high with the type of things that returns, whether it's infrastructure, education, other investments. It's going to take time, and it's not going to get you that level. So it means that you need to actually do your own analysis and scenarios of what would be the feasible, affordable, and over what horizon. And then we can have a conversation. So I think, we need to own, there are things that we need to just shift on how we do, but then moving to the other part that, for the international community, I think we had the G20 Common Framework. I'm quoted about it saying that it's neither a framework nor common. I think it's a good summary of how I see it. Part of it is based on this issue of case by case. However, there has to be common parameters that actually facilitate the speed of the process. Part of the issue is that we have new creditors that are new to that landscape. They have not been in that process. They have not built 80 years of experience of dealing with, debt negotiations. So there is a learning process, but we cannot be in the middle of this, meaning we need to get actually solutions. So I would say for the G20 Common Framework, if we go for, and I'll be very frank, if we go for another solution, another framework, how long it has taken just to establish this. So I think we need to focus, especially with the African Union G20 seat. Now we're actually, at the table with the African Union membership of the G20, we can influence the discussion on what needs to be changed, and we need to really use that well and wisely to make sure, for example, that countries that apply get debt service suspension upon application. They cannot, while they wait for the framework, and should not take that long, but while they wait, they cannot continue to pay interest payments. Is just, I mean, there is no incentive for the other side to speed up. So that, I would say, is a very important issue. Second, you need to have a framework also that includes middle-income countries. There are many African middle-income countries that are suffering, but then the framework is not eligible. They're currently not eligible. So we need to broaden the framework to do that. We need to have a formula of comparability of treatment, so that there is, like, basic agreement on principles between debtors and creditors on understanding what is the comparability of treatment, what does it mean. And I think for that to happen, a very important issue is how do we include private sector in the in the process, because now it's no longer the 80s and 90s where you had mainly bilateral creditors. We have a large share of the private creditor, and the system, how it works is, you first deal with the bilateral, you finish that, and then you move to the private sector. But then some of the bilaterals do not trust that the private sector is not going to get a better deal. And same thing, with the private credit. So we cannot have a sequential process and then go back from the beginning. It needs to be an integrated process where these discussions happen simultaneously, whether because they are included already in the process or because we create structures that actually work in parallel. That will make a huge difference in terms of how we go forward. Another very important issue is, for IMF, for example, they have something called lending into arrears policies. So basically, to allow the process to go, without reducing leverage for, holdout creditors. This is a very important tool. We need to make sure that this is used in a bolder way. So these are the type of things that we really need to advance. It's not going to be easy, but we need a more timely, a more predictable system, time-bound and transparent. And the more that we can achieve toward this, the better. It's going to take time to move to actually something that we can call common, but approaching in this way would at least achieve progress, because we cannot afford to keep it as it is. I mean, I can say a lot more, but I'd like to stop here and leave the floor for the audience. Thank you.
Excellent and elaborate as usual. And I would like really to appreciate, the words that you just put forward. I wanted to maybe widen the discussion and include, one minister, but I don't know if he's willing to share his perspective, because respectfully, and I sincerely apologize to insist, because when you listen to Anan, she said something important, and she highlighted the good example that Rwanda is posting, in various sectors. So I would like to give the floor to the minister, maybe to share his perspective, given the presentation and also the intervention by Anan. Your Excellency, thank you very much for accepting my kind invitation to speak.
Thank you. Let me start by thanking the three speakers, the Minister of Finance of Egypt, the Presidential Advisor of Mauritania, and the CEO of Development Reimagining. for the brilliant contributions to the debate on debt relief with clear proposals. I want to make just one point relevant for the African continent as we address the issue of debt and sustainable development. In my view, we need to fight on two fronts: the global front and the domestic front at the same time. On the global front, we must fight for fair and fast debt relief as a short-term measure, but also for the reform of the international financial architecture for medium and the long term. On this global front, we need also to recognize that we have limited ability to influence the reform, as there are major decision makers, which are mainly the G7 and the G20 countries. However, we cannot give up. We need to continue to fight and make the best use of our new position, our new seat in the G20. On the domestic front, there is more to do in terms of macroeconomic reforms and public finance management. And this domestic front is relatively under our control. I therefore thank the African Union and the UNECA for their contribution on the global front, and urge them to also look inward and identify concrete measures at continental level and at national level for a sustainable development. Because as we saw historically, this debt issues is recurrent, it keeps coming. So as we address the short term, we need to look at the long-term solution, both at the global level and at domestic level. But I believe efforts are needed on both fronts. I know UNECA is doing a lot of work in this direction, so we are ready to continue to working with you and ensure that as we address the current crisis, we also build the resilience to future shocks. I thank you.
Brilliant, Your Excellency, and you see why I was insisting on you to speak, because you outlined two priorities, sketching the international commitment and achievement that we need to take into consideration, because you insisted on the need for the deep reform of the GFA, Global Financial Architecture, and you also highlighted the fact that despite the fact that we are certainly not yet stronger as we should be, it is a persistent fight that we need to continue pushing for. So thank you for that. Secondly, you spoke about domestic reforms that are also imperative to make sure that we are not, going back to another cycle of problems as we navigate forward. So structural transformation, economic transformation and diversification was key to the words that you just put forward. So thank you very much. In this discussion, there is a continued, consensus that African financial institutions should be part of that important, drive that we are trying to put forward. Minister Mayer this morning, unfortunately, he has to leave, but you remember what he said. He said that it is imperative for African countries, as we move into this international conversation on debt, to capacitate our domestic institutions, our financial institutions, with the right capacities. And Anand, when you spoke, you also highlighted, the need for strong, domestic financial institutions. He insisted, Minister Maya, this morning, on the need to strengthen the capacities of institutions such as the African Development Bank, the African Import-Export Bank, Afrexim Bank, but also Shelter Afrique Development Banks, and all the banks that are also working on that, on those issues. You remember that in February this year, we had a conversation with presidents from the African Union, in our premises in Addis Ababa, and they also insisted, on the need for capacitating our financial institutions. So, just to pick your brain very quickly, and you said it already, but I want to be clear. We have this conversation on IDA replenishment for concessional loans. But what we are forgetting is that we also have domestic instruments that are promoted by our financial institutions, such as, the African Development Fund, which, if we look at the comparative advantage of, is much more tailored to find solutions to our problems. And you've said it clearly that our member states have been able to use those institutions as effectively as possible to accelerate access to international concessional loans. So, I don't know, in the room I see Afrexim Bank. Would you want to share 2 minutes perspective, or do you want me to start with Shelter Afrique? Yes, in the room we have Shelter Afrique CAO, Shelter Afrique Development Bank. I would like to invite you to share your perspective on this important discussion we're having today. The floor is yours, my dear brother Habib.
Thank you very much, my brother. Really thanking the African Union for having us as the African multilateral financial institutions in the room, because many times we are forgotten in some of those conversations, while we think that we should really be at the front seat discussing with other MDBs, which sometimes we are invited, including the first MDB's Coalition for Development at the last World Bank, IMF annual meetings that happened in Marrakesh. They held the first MDB's Coalition discussion, and we were in the room. So I think something is changing, and which is very much appreciated. I just want to start by really appreciating His Excellency, Minister of Rwanda. The way he really put it couldn't be much more pedagogical and easy to grasp for any newcomers in this conversation. Looking at it from a global perspective and a domestic perspective. And I would say that, both global and domestic actually go together, right? And from our perspective, and let me just start first to say that I also do represent here in this room our colleagues that couldn't make it from the Alliance of African Multilateral Financial Institutions, AMFI, which is also coined the Africa Club, which is an alliance of African multilaterals basically based in Africa and that are driving development. So we are 7 institutions that are part of this alliance, and we were recently launched at the African Union Heads of State Summit in Addis Ababa recently, and we're very happy to have several heads of states actually lead this, and President of Ghana was chairing it, President Ruto was there, President of Zambia, and many other presidents as well, and it was highly acclaimed at the plenary of the heads of states as well, that it's really commendable that we're able to come together as African multilaterals to see how we can strengthen our capacity and our impact on the continent, especially in these days where many other countries globally have their own priorities and issues. Madame spoke about the security issues. It's almost like a swap between financing development to financing security now, international security. So I think it's important that our institutions actually play the role in this current environment. So I want to touch on 4 main points here, especially focusing mainly on the domestic part, because this is where we see our role as multilaterals based in Africa with a specific mandate. So the first point I want to talk about is the whole idea of debt for development swap. Okay, I really like that idea, and we all remember past restructuring that have happened in many countries. Some of those debts to development into different sectors did work, right? I mean, you mentioned good examples in Rwanda, Zambia, and others. So I think this is where, as African multilaterals, we can also play a role, right? I mean, Shelter Afrique Development Bank, as you all know, was set up 42 years ago by the African Development Bank and many African states. So today we have 44 African countries that are shareholders. And our role is to really drive economic development in our cities. So it's about urban development, affordable housing development, and job creation. So it's really at the heart of economic development. And the way we see this debt to development swap is really prioritizing the sectors that can really push growth in our economies. So in the housing construction, urban development value chain, we can see great opportunities to do that. So that could be one particular sector, and it's linked to infrastructure as well. Housing is infrastructure, so that's why our space is very important. And other institutions that are part of the alliance also have their own space. Trade is extremely important. You mentioned Afrexim Bank, TDB, and others that are members of the alliance can also play a role in terms of deploying this reallocated capital right into the economy. The second point I want to talk about is the cost of debt versus growth in our economies. Okay, the cost of growth is the cost of debt is extremely high. I mean, I think Madame mentioned numbers like 10% in an economy. If you have a cost of debt at 10% and the growth is below 10% growth of GDP, how do you want these economies to actually grow? So it's going to be difficult. So whatever you're getting on one side, you're spending double of it in servicing your debt. So I think it's extremely important to look at the cost of debt, how to reduce it. And one way we as African multilateral financial institutions, the way we do it is through blended finance, right? So it's raising concessional funding via international multilaterals, bilaterals and others, and blend with our commercial funding, right? So commercial funding from debt capital markets, from different other financiers to scale up, right? The funding available, the capital available to deploy in the economies. So blended finance is extremely important, and we've been in discussions with institutions such as the World Bank and others, African Development Bank, to raise those concessional funding that we will come and complement and scale up with private and commercial resources to do more. The third element, kind of linked to the second one, is about domestic resource mobilization, right? So this has to do about local resource mobilization. The way we do it as multilaterals in Africa is to raise local currency funding in our economies. Some people will tell you that we have a lot of money in Africa. We do have a lot of local currency funding. We might not have dollars or euros and hard currency, but we do have our own local currency. If we can leverage the source of funding within the countries, first of all, we reduce the impact of FX fluctuations and all the currency pressure we have across African countries today. So if we're able to mobilize, local currency through capital markets, that would really help drive growth locally and reduce risk in terms of exposure. And this is exactly what we do as African multilaterals. Shelter Afrique Development Bank, as an example, raised 46 billion nairas in Nigeria. This is out of a $200 billion MTN program, medium-term note program. So it's in the capital markets in Nigeria. And currently we are deploying this funding we raised in Naira from Nigeria to the Nigerian developers, financial institutions to support the growth of the housing and urban development sector. So we're doing this. We've done this in Kenya back in the days, in Kenyan shilling. We raised money in the local capital markets, and many other countries. So we're looking to do more of this to help support our countries finance their development without actually putting weight on the balance sheet of the public sector. And that takes me to the fourth point, which is really about making sure that our countries leverage us. Because we are institutions set up by treaty by the African countries. Shelter Africa has 44 country members so far. Other institutions have even 54, and others have a bit less. But we've been set up by these countries to actually finance development within the countries. So we are an instrument for the different governments to use without actually putting weight on the government balance sheet, right? So we can deploy in the market. So finally, it's really about strengthening the sustainability of such institutions, the African multilateral financial institutions, as I said, by reducing the burden on government balance sheet, because we can raise funding from the capital markets on our own balance sheet and finance development within the countries without this showing up in the debt of the government in the countries. And then the MDB's coalition, I spoke about it, so really getting us a bit more involved in these conversations. Yesterday I was at an event with the World Bank and IMF, and they discussed about this MDB coalition that's now effective from last year at the annual meetings in Marrakesh, and we're looking forward to being invited in those conversations. And then private sector resource mobilization. This is part of what we do in terms of raising funding in the capital markets and really working with the private sector to scale up concessional funding, right, to do more. And finally, I like the whole concept of integrated process instead of making it sequential, right? So we have different stakeholders that can finance growth in the economy. It will be important that they are all involved in the conversation. So not just the public sector or international organizations, but also the local MDBs like us, and also the private sector in the same conversation. So I just want to stop there and really thank you again for the opportunity, and we're looking forward to be part of this conversation going forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Habib. And without any further development, I know that we are 2 minutes behind the schedule, but can we just take maybe 2 questions and then we wrap the discussion? Okay, I can start with Zambia, and then I will come to Nigeria, and Nigeria. Zambia.
Okay, thank you very much, moderator, and thank you, our colleagues, for the good presentation. I think I'll throw my question to, is it Hannah? I come from Zambia, member of parliament in Zambia, and I was just wondering, these the reform proposals, the great one which you have presented, I haven't seen anything that which basically speaks about the legislative process. You gave good examples of Zambia, the debt situation in which we are coming from. And I think largely for me, and I'm not embarrassed to say it, it's as a result of lack of a good legislative framework, where you give, say, the Minister of Finance an open check to contract the debt, without the approval of Parliament. So in fact, the reforms we have given, for me, are reforms after the horse has already bolted. Are you able to consider members of the African Union Commission to come up with some levels of say, benchmarking on these African countries, just to assess what levels of legislative frameworks that they do have to insulate themselves from this? Because some of these problems, I think, are as a result of such. So do you have, I want just a comment on that. Thank you.
Be from Zambia again. I'm also a member of parliament. Looking at your presentation, not highlighted in terms of the revenue side of these African countries. Multinationals, including these lending institutions domestically, they look at the borrower's ability to repay. And that is attached to so many resources that the African continent has. You've not talked about how best as Africans we can exploit our resources in terms of reforms. You are talking about financial architecture reforms, but we are not looking at trade, how best as an African continent we can exploit these resources to our advantage. What is your comment? Because Africa is not supposed to be talking about debt. We are so rich. We are talking of the EV. We have all the resources. We have the lithium, we have the coltan, we have everything that the world needs. Do you honestly think that we can be talking about debt, or we should be talking about reforms to do with the exploitation of our resources for the betterment of our people? I submit.
Thank you very much. Nigeria?
Thank you very much. Let me say I agree. My name is Patience Suniha. Let me say I agree with many of the things that have been said. You know, one cap doesn't fit all. Timeline for the relief being long. Just wanted to add also that when you get into a debt distress, it just becomes a vicious cycle. You can't access new funds. If you can, you have to pay higher. So you just get worse while that is going on. But I wanted to highlight maybe 3 points. The first one is the discussions, and I think this started from 2000 of debt relief has always been focused on the external. So all the presentations today were external, and I was wondering, maybe that is because most or many African countries really the challenge is with external debt. But some countries like Nigeria actually have a developed domestic market, and 60% of our debt is domestic, meaning in the local currency. So what's the challenge with that? Money is available, we're able to raise funds for 30 years. It's all from issuing securities. We're able to raise funds for 30 years. But with inflation, borrowing costs is now about 18 to 23%. So it means there's a problem there, and we shouldn't just focus. So I keep wondering why external is the only focus. Really, domestic, we have it available, but it is expensive, and it's a larger part of our portfolio. The other point, so my second point very quickly is, I think we need to go back also to the issue around the use of borrowed funds. So we keep asking for more money, we get monies for reforms, but maybe they're making some small changes, but you don't get those monies for infrastructure, things that actually then promote growth with me. So the monies go, you're servicing them, but they're not so much tangible thing that came out of it. So I see most of the funds going in that direction, not into, growth-related issues. My final point really, and this has always been of concern to me, so I'm grateful for a forum like this. In the 2000s, these were the issues we were discussing, early 2000, debt relief. Okay, we were all good students, we did everything we were asked to do, debt sustainability analysis, medium term, all the things we were supposed to do. We're back to where we were then. So obviously something is wrong, and I think in the immediate term, while we're trying to find out what is wrong, what didn't work right, that we always say it is external shocks, COVID, Russia, Ukraine. It did affect other countries as well, but they had the resilience, the advanced countries, to absorb it. They're paying subsidies, they're running with welfare issues. They're able to absorb it. So something is wrong, in this neighborhood. So what I wanted to ask is, how can we avoid sitting at the table 10 years, 20 years from now? And I think in the short term, we really need to get development finance at a very low rate, while we then really do the things we need to do, which many of you have spoken about. So development finance means very long term, 50 years, maybe 30 years would work, very concessional, while we then do the right things. And I take the point the legislator said from Rwanda, we have resources. Okay? There's trade coming up, so we need to look at a balance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think this closes the round of question, and really it was, an extremely engaging discussion, because I can see that now we are teasing out the real root causes of our issues. Anna, the floor is to you to respond to some of the comments and questions.
Let me be very brief, because we are over time, but I know some of the questions were directly to the presentation. Thank you very much, first of all. I think the focus of today on both on external debt, but also generally on the reform of the international system. We have many conversations, we have many amazing institutions on the continent, including the African peer review mechanism. We also have the Pan-African legislators and so on. We have a number of different institutions which work together. We also have the African legal, the ALSF, yes, who are all doing the work and trying to build the capacity of countries to improve the legislative systems, to improve transparency, to improve governance, and to bring countries together to share together on those issues. I am not in any way saying those are not important. I believe they're very important. I engage in those organizations, and as Development Reimagined, definitely we think it's crucial. At the same time, we would be concerned that that would be the only way. And sometimes I think many of these proposals, they're presented as if the key work that needs to be done is by the country. Yes? But actually, it's a two-way system. We have to have the international system work and the countries work. And my view is, over the last 40 years or so, most of the work has been done by us Africans. We have done a lot of work, but things have not changed enough for us in terms of the system. So we will continue working on that. We'll continue to do that, and I think it's extremely important that we do. We should drive up our own standards. We should be very strong in what we think is right and what we think is transparent, what is the best kind of spending. Madam here was talking about the importance of spending that generates growth. We can have our countries exchange that experience. We're talking about domestic debt, the experience of Ghana just recently on renegotiating domestic debt. Zambia is also working on that. If we work together, some of the proposals are around coordination. These are the kinds of proposals that that can help make a difference. So I hope that helps as a very brief answer to several of the questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. I thought I was getting off the hook, but no, thank you very much. It's really like a fantastic conversation and a very engaging one as well. I mean, number of very important issues have been raised. How do we get that long-term finance? I believe a crucial part of the solution is having this, a bigger role for multilateral development banks, and that includes our own, generally, but also our own. So that's really the way forward: bigger and better and more effective multilateral development banks. So channeling through that, because they have an advantage that just the bilateral donors don't have, which is ability to create leverage, 3-4 times of leverage. So if you want scale and we want long-term and financing, we need to make sure that we support that. And then on the issue, you raised a very important issue. I don't think we have sufficient time to do that. Perhaps we need to have another discussion on it, which is the domestic debt. Because this is a very important area, but usually also you're very careful about how you handle for the reason that a large share of the government debt tend to be held by commercial banks. Okay, so that have implications for the stability of your financial system. So it's one thing that you think number of times before going there, because it can affect the trust in that system. So that's, I mean, part of also like, what it makes it, a very important issue that deserves discussion, but perhaps this is something we can have, a dedicated session on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anand. And I would like now, with no further development, because I can see that we are, behind the schedule. So, Your Excellency, I would like to give the floor to you for your final remarks and maybe respond, if possible, to one of the questions that was raised. À vous la parole, Monsieur le Ministre.
Merci infiniment. Donc, je pense que la qualité du débat et les interventions des uns et des autres ont permis de placer et de poser les bonnes questions. On a posé les bonnes questions durant cette une heure et demie de discussion. Et je pense que l'Afrique aujourd'hui est appelée à apporter ou à explorer les bonnes réponses à ces questions. On a une crise de dette, on a une prise de conscience quand même qui est très intéressante et qui constitue un très bon point de départ pour trouver les solutions à cette crise. Je pense que le point de départ, c'est les efforts à développer l'Afrique elle-même et à diversifier les sources de financement, à commencer par les financements intérieurs, et aussi à plaider avec toutes les bonnes initiatives pour réformer l'architecture financière mondiale. Donc, sans vouloir vraiment aller dans les détails, je pense que Hanan et tous les autres collègues, et même les excellences, monsieur le ministre des Finances d'Égypte et de Rwanda, ont posé les bonnes questions et ont fait un excellent diagnostic. Aujourd'hui, à nous de prendre à bras le corps cette question et à continuer à persévérer dans ce sens avec toutes les initiatives, les bonnes initiatives qui se trouvent. Donc, je pense qu'on a posé, comme je l'ai dit, les bonnes questions et on doit explorer des pistes pour trouver les bonnes réponses. Et je vous remercie.
Excellent. Distinguished Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I think this brings us to the concluding of our meeting this morning, but I would like to conclude by maybe re-emphasizing what you just rightly said. What can we do to make sure that we are not in a debt trapped, in the next few years? And one of the critical points that was raised here is to make sure that we are able to leverage on the opportunities that the continent is posting. One of the critical opportunities is the market. You have a market of approximately 1.4 billion people today, with an expected population of 2.7 billion in just 2 decades. And that population will be the essence of certainly the global growth. And at the African Union Commission, we have, concluded a study, which is not just a study, but a strategic framework with the African Development Bank and many other institutions to make sure that we are able to position our countries in a 7 to 10% growth in the next few decades. This is important because we are strongly, aware of the fact that we still have pockets of opportunities in terms of how we can fuel our growth. And I thank the Zambian delegation that highlighted the fact that we are endowed with all the resources that are important in that transformative process. So it was a great pleasure having you today, Excellencies, distinguished panelists. Thank you once again for having been such a wonderful audience, because you've been able to follow us from beginning till the end. And we wish you an excellent day and a wonderful spring meetings as we proceeding forward. Excellences, dear panélistes, Anna, Hanan et Monsieur le Ministre, merci beaucoup pour votre présence ce matin. Bonne journée et à très bientôt.
My colleague is.